Subcommittee will come to order, and today we want to welcome the officials from USDA, Department of Agriculture, to discuss USDA's role in disaster recovery. We'll also assess the department's need for a third supplemental appropriation bill. The administration supplemental request submitted to Congress on November 17th included almost $1 billion for USDA, not including funds requested for the Forest Service. To discuss this request and the USDA's activities, we're pleased to have with us this morning Dr. Robert Johansson, the Acting Deputy Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation and Chief Economist. Also, Mr. Steve Peterson, Acting Administrator of the Farm Service Agency, and Mr. Leonard Jordan, the Acting Chief of Natural Resources Conservation Service. Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria have absolutely devastated parts of the country, and especially Texas, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. Hurricanes Harvey and Irma are estimated each to have caused $42 and $65 billion in property damage, and Hurricane Maria is expected to be even higher. Other areas of the country have been grappling with drought, floods, wildfires, and other natural disasters. When America's farmers, ranchers, rural communities, and those who depend on USDA's nutrition programs are impacted by the weather disasters, USDA is able to utilize the existing authorities to begin assisting those that are most severely impacted. We appreciate USDA's recent efforts to assist farmers and ranchers through crop insurance and other emergency disaster and conservation programs. For those in need of nutrition assistance, USDA has partnered with our nation's food banks and others to provide food and has worked with state agencies to implement disaster supplemental nutrition assistance programs, or DSNAP, and help affected households get nutrition assistance benefits. USDA's rural development staff has been working with various partners to restore power, improve water quality, help people find temporary housing, and they continue to work with borrowers to assist in recovering from financial hardships. Thankfully, USDA has the resources and the flexibility to begin operating these programs when the disaster strikes. While Congress has already provided over $51 billion to assist those impacted by the storms, we know that our constituents and colleagues that unprecedented needs remain. The response can strain USDA's resources, and additional funds and resources may be needed to get things back on the way they were before the storm. For example, the governor of Texas has submitted a request for $61 billion. The governor of Puerto Rico has asked for $94 billion. The governor of the U.S. Virgin Islands is seeking at nearly $7 billion. The Florida delegation has submitted a letter to the administration describing a $2.5 billion in damage to Florida's agricultural sector, including more than $760 million in losses to the citrus industry. We know there is extensive fruit loss and tree damage that may need to be addressed. With regards to the possibility of any additional assistance for crop losses, it is my intention to take a methodical approach to the issue. First, we will look at the USDA's preliminary estimates of economic losses in the agricultural sector. Second, we'll examine how much estimated assistance USDA or private insurance companies will provide under existing programs like crop insurance. And finally, look at the net loss to see the economic impact. We will take these factors into consideration as we move forward into the supplemental funding package. I also hope to discuss some ways that this can be accomplished if it is deemed necessary. Dr. Johansson, I want to thank Secretary Perdue for loaning you over here for us today to have you before our subcommittee. I understand that any numbers that you provide here today are based upon the best estimate that you have at your disposal. It's still too early to finalize the actual damage that has been done, and I'd ask all members in subcommittee of the subcommittee to take this into account during the question time later on in the hearing. We look forward to discussing the actions USDA has taken already to help farmers, ranchers, and rural communities, as well as USDA's role in moving forward so that we can help rebuild, replant, and restore hope for America's coping with the losses that has occurred in the past. Again, we appreciate all of you being here today for taking time of your schedule to talk to the subcommittee. And with that, I'd like to recognize Mr. Bishop, the ranking member of this subcommittee, whose state was hit by Hurricane Irma, for any opening remarks that he might have. So, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me welcome Mr. Johansson, Mr. Jordan, and Mr. Peterson. We definitely appreciate your being here today. Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased that we're having a hearing on USDA's role in this country's recovery efforts, which will include discussing the administration's third disaster supplemental, as well as USDA's relevant mandatory programs. USDA has been called upon to help agricultural and rural communities across the nation that have been affected by numerous disasters. A quick recap. Our country has suffered from devastating wildfires in the West, as the chairman indicated, tornadoes in Georgia, Texas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, Wisconsin, and Louisiana, and catastrophic hurricanes extending from Texas to Georgia and the Caribbean. Our nation's resolve and commitment to take care of its own is really, truly being tested. And I, for one, don't want to see us fail. I'm sure that the chairman and I are of the same mind and that we're looking forward to working together, along with our distinguished subcommittee colleagues, to ensure that all of the needs are met and they're met in a timely manner. I'm heartened by the statements that many of my Republican colleagues have made in reference to the administration's first regular budget request, to the fact that it was only the beginning of the conversation and not the last word. I see this supplemental request in the same way. It's only the start of the conversation, and unfortunately, it's an inadequate one at that. If enacted as it is, it would send, I believe, the wrong message to our fellow citizens and the members of the world community about our willingness and ability to care for our own, and it would drastically slow down aid to areas hard hit by disasters, needlessly prolonging the misery and the suffering, with particularly harsh effects in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The administration characterized the request as fully covering damages from Hurricanes Harvey and Irma, while only covering medium-term needs in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands due to Hurricane Maria. However, lawmakers in states affected by Harvey and Irma have spoken out to say that they see this request as inadequate. And I agree. The package does not represent enough of an investment to truly get the recovery efforts in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands on track to where they need to be. In Puerto Rico alone, it is said that approximately 40% of the island is without power and sufficient water. And I recently heard from the Virgin Islands delegation that only 16% of St. Croix has power. My own home state of Georgia suffered severe damage as Hurricane Irma moved out of Florida, and earlier this year, we led the nation in the number of tornadoes, which is not a record any state wants to hold. As many of you have heard me boast before, Georgia is a major agricultural state, 42,000 farms, contributing almost $75 billion annually to the state and the national economies. It's number one in the nation for the production of poultry, peanuts, pecans, blueberries, and privately owned timberlands. My district leads the state in peanuts, cotton, pecans, fruits and vegetables, as well as family-owned timberlands. Of the 29 counties that I represent, 26 of those are rural, with average populations of between 10 and 15,000 people. These counties are some of the most economically disadvantaged counties in the state and in the nation. They've suffered losses that have yet to be satisfactorily addressed. I'm concerned that the President's requests before us will only serve as a drop in the bucket as we enter the repair and rebuild phase following the disasters of 2017. We are now 32 days away from the end of calendar year 2017 and the beginning of 2018. If 18 is anything like 17 and we continue to nickel and dime the country, the road to recovery will be but a pipe dream. The USDA portion of the package that we have jurisdiction over totals approximately $1 billion. In isolation, that sounds like a large number. However, when you look at the damage estimates coming in from the affected states and territories, it pales in comparison to the actual needs on the ground. Mr. Chairman and Mr. Johansson, I'm also deeply concerned that we're not seeing any requests regarding meeting the nutritional needs of the disaster victims. As I've said before, there are limits to doing more with less, and you surely can't try that when we're in an emergency situation. That is when the country needs all hands on deck, and it appears that the administration is still having trouble realizing that. But I assure you that there are many good members of Congress who know it and are doing all that we can to ensure that this nation does not fall by the wayside. It's my hope that the supplemental will see a lot of improvement before it comes to us on the House floor. As you can see, we do have a lot to discuss today, and Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to welcome our witnesses and to share my concerns. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Mr. Johansson, without objection, your entire written testimony will be included in the record, and following statement, we'll proceed on with the question. So you may begin.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bishop, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to present the Department of Agriculture's disaster assistance request and answer any questions you may have. I'm accompanied by Steve Peterson, Acting Administrator for Farm Service Agency, and Leonard Jordan, Acting Chief, Natural Resource Conservation Service. In 2017, ag producers in several areas were severely impacted by hurricanes, major hurricanes, and USDA's assessment of losses for most of those events are still ongoing. But early assessments by state extension ag departments indicate significant damage, including crop losses, animal mortality, and infrastructure losses and disruptions. I included details about those assessments in my written testimony for your review. I wish to convey the message that USDA's disaster programs and the crop insurance program are working. These programs provide America's farmers and ranchers with critical financial and technical support when it is needed most. The agencies that make up the new Farm Production and Conservation Mission Area, our FPAC, our FSA, NRCS, and the Risk Management Agency, RMA, are on the front lines to provide assistance to farmers and ranchers impacted by the recent hurricanes. We have put people before process by extending deadlines for submitting paperwork, mobilized our human resources to areas of greatest need, and exercised maximum flexibility provided in law to provide the greatest amount of assistance. Our employees performed extensive outreach to ensure that farmers and ranchers are aware of USDA assistance through local and social media, outreach meetings, and personal contacts. Assistance is offered in multiple languages to ensure people receive the support they need. Many times, USDA employees put their own disaster recovery efforts on hold to ensure that their neighbors and other impacted individuals receive service and personal support. FSA's suite of disaster programs, the Tree Assistance Program, TAP, Livestock Forage Disaster Program, or LFP, the Livestock Indemnity Program, LIP, Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, and Farm-Raised Fish Program, or ELAP, the Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program, or NAP, the Emergency Conservation Program, ECP, and Emergency Forest Restoration Program, EFRP, have paid producers billions since the 2014 Farm Bill was enacted. Those programs provide assistance to producers to recover from livestock, forage, and crop losses, damage to trees, shrubs, and vines, damage to private forests, and farmland damages due to flooding. NRCS provides disaster assistance recovery for livestock mortality and natural resource damages, helps communities restore damaged infrastructure and stabilize stream banks, and incorporates measures to reduce losses from future natural disasters through conservation technical assistance, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, and the Emergency Watershed Program, or EWP. Many producers impacted by natural disasters in 2017 carried federal crop insurance to help mitigate their risk. The crop insurance program administered by RMA provides a strong safety net to producers during times of natural disaster. In 2017 to date, FSA has received over 3,000 applications for TAP, LFP, and LIP, and received more than $158 million in requests for ECP and $175,000 for EFRP. FSA has received over 2,000 notices of hurricane-related losses under NAP NRCS has completed nearly 500 EWP damage surveys, and RMA has received nearly 570 hurricane-related claims totaling $44 million thus far. Hurricane-related insurance indemnities for Puerto Rico so far have totaled $1.5 million. While many of USDA's disaster assistance programs have flexible funding that can expand to meet the needs of all eligible applicants, several programs depend on appropriations to ensure funding is available to meet all needs. USDA is requesting nearly $1 billion in funding for those programs to assist areas impacted by Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria in their recovery efforts, along with needs for areas impacted by wildfire. The requested disaster supplemental includes $465 million for 3 FSA programs, $375 million for ECP, $50 million for EFRP, and $40 million for the ELAP program. $500 million request for NRCS's EWP and $1 million in addition for USDA's Office of Inspector General to support audits and investigations of USDA disaster programs. USDA stands ready to implement any additional disaster relief for our crop and livestock producers as directed by Congress. This concludes my formal statement, and we'd be happy to respond to any questions you might have.
Thank you. As Congress begins to take a look at the potential supplemental assistance package for hurricanes and wildfires that occurred this year, I'd like to examine USDA's role in assisting the agricultural sector. Between the FY 2000 and 2013, USDA received only 2% of the total funding that Congress provided in the disaster-related supplemental funding bills. However, this should not serve as an indicator for its importance in recovery efforts, particularly in our nation's food supply in rural areas. I believe it is important when examining an issue to begin with a full view of the problem. In that regard, I would like to ascertain the extent of the damage done of the various agricultural sectors and related crop and economic losses as a result of the hurricanes. Once we have determined a state-by-state economic analysis of the loss and damage done by the various crops, the next step is to determine what current programs exist and how much assistance will be provided. From there, we can determine what the difference is and if any additional assistance needs to be provided and in what form. I think it's important to know that the federal government can't always be in the business of making farmers whole. Everyone knows that farming does come with some inherent risks. On the other hand, it's our nation's best interest to assist people in getting back on their feet. Dr. Johansson, what I'd like to ask is, can you briefly inform the committee as to why USDA believes that the federal government needs to provide a safety net program for agricultural sector and, in some very rare cases, assistance beyond the standard Farm Bill safety net programs?
As you mentioned, we've had a number of disasters since 2000, and we have seen in the Farm Bill different programs being implemented to help provide disaster relief. Certainly one trend that we've seen over the authorized Farm Bill programs has been a movement towards risk management, and so we have seen a strengthening of the crop insurance component of the Farm Bill. Certainly we have also seen standing disaster programs enacted in the 2008 Farm Bill become permanent in the 2014 Farm Bill to cover a lot of livestock as well as some of the other programs I mentioned. To the extent that we need to look for additional appropriations for some of our disaster programs such as ECP and EWP and ELAP, we look to Congress to provide additional funding through appropriations to meet the needs of producers that are both affected by major disasters such as hurricanes, but also some of the other disasters that we've seen across the United States over in previous months that perhaps have not been included in other funding mechanisms, such as some of the tornadoes that Ranking Member Bishop mentioned, as well as certainly we have seen a significant drought in the upper northern Great Plains as well. We know that producers have taken advantage of the crop insurance program and participated in different rates across different commodities at different coverage levels. And certainly that's one thing that I'm sure that we're going to be discussing today in terms of where we've seen participation being larger or not as large as may have been in the interest of the producers, given the fact that they haven't seen crop losses over a number of years, and then of course this disaster occurs right now, and they're left without as much coverage as they may want. And in that case, it would be up to the committee to provide guidance to the department on what appropriate levels are in Congress's interest to provide additional assistance to those producers.
In your dual role as Acting Deputy Director, Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation, and as Chief Economist, can you give us an overall monetary estimate of the economic losses? Of course, I understand only a range would you could only do that, but particularly which occurred in the ag industry resulting from these recent storms and the wildfires.
So certainly we've been trying to come up with a reasonable estimate based on what we've seen from the states. We know that there's a lot of desire to estimate what the losses are, and while at first it seems like a question that might be easy to answer, there's a lot of factors that we need to take into account when we come up with a loss estimate. For example, one thing we've heard of from producers, particularly cotton producers in Texas and Georgia, is that they were expecting a very large crop this year, a very good crop, and we know that in unaffected areas of Georgia and Texas, production has been above trend, for example. So when you go into a disaster situation, the loss many times that producers are discussing are losses relative to what they saw in their fields prior to the hurricane hitting versus absent information from those individual producers. We look to what producers may have expected to produce in a given year based on averages, based on trend yield, for example. And so one reason you may see a difference between what our estimate is and what states are producing is because we're looking at a different baseline in terms of coming up with the loss. Again, just to mention, we have seen claims come in, and based on those claims, we tried to come up with an estimate that's reasonable for the producers that we assume will have a loss. We know that there's a lot of producers that are going to be out there that have a loss that aren't going to provide a claim because the loss doesn't raise to the level of their deductible. And we know that there's a large number of producers out there that don't have insurance, and another segment of the producer distribution that would also have no loss or above trend yield. So in trying to piece together all of those parts of an estimate, we did look at the information we have so far as through November 20th to look at what producers' claims have come in. Of course, the claims from Texas would have been more developed. We would have seen more information coming in from Hurricane Harvey than we have from Hurricane Irma. Again, the data, of course, from Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands is very limited, and so, again, we're relying on the best data we have available to us. So based on those estimates, we calculated total crop loss for the disaster areas of slightly above roughly $2.2 billion. Of that, we assume that it's likely that crop insurance will cover roughly a quarter, or about $470 million worth of that loss. Now, of course, that is for the covered commodities that we have for crop insurance products available for. There are a number of products that aren't covered by crop insurance, like, for example, under the non-insured NAP program for losses. Mr. Peterson can talk about those estimates as well, but we have a good number of smaller, mostly fruit and vegetable crops that are covered under the NAP program that we also have losses for that aren't incorporated in the numbers I just gave you. Splitting that out by state, for example, or in the case of Puerto Rico, we assume that the total loss in Puerto Rico would be approximately $330 million for crop losses. For Texas, $306 million. Louisiana, about $13 million. Georgia, about $650 million. And for Florida, about $895 million.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask some questions along the same line. I've got two questions. One of them is general and one of them is more parochial. So I'm going to ask them both together to try to expedite the time. Your supplemental request for USDA is around $1 billion, and it includes $275 million for the Emergency Conservation Program, $500 million for the Emergency Watershed Protection Program, $50 million for the Emergency Forest Restoration Program. The total agriculture ask for all the programs that we've seen from Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Texas, Florida, California totals $10.5 billion. That's a huge disparity, and one of the reasons there's been bipartisan disappointment over the administration's supplemental request. We realize that you may be getting in estimates slowly from Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, but asking for a number that is closer to what officials from those states and territories are asking for would seem to give the people more confidence that we actually intend to address the damage from the disasters appropriately. Can you tell me what information did USDA ask OMB to provide, and how did that information develop into the request that we received? Why would the request be so inadequate when the needs are obviously so much greater? That's the general question. The more specific question I'd like to ask, more parochial. Pecan orchards in Georgia were some of the hardest hit during the recent southeastern storms. And Secretary Perdue saw firsthand the damage and loss of the pecan trees across Georgia. The Tree Assistance Program, the TAP program, should be the program that growers go to for assistance. But my pecan growers tell me that it's not a program that's working. Can you tell me why this program is not more effective for tree nut producers in the case of tree losses or damage? And would you be willing, would you review the program and determine why it has not been effective in cases such as the recent storms and report that information back to us so that we can perhaps respond to it appropriately?
So for pecans, I'll let Mr. Peterson talk a little bit about the TAP program. As far as the crop insurance provisions for pecan trees, we did recently put out a product for pecan tree coverage, which was not purchased by most pecan tree growers in Georgia. I think only 11 policies or maybe 8 policies were sold on the pecan tree. I think a lot of producers do have pecan coverage for the crop, but not for the trees. With any new product that we usually put out, oftentimes there's initially slow uptake of the program, and we would expect that program to grow over time. Of course, that is obviously not going to help producers this year, the fact that it wasn't available. I talked to producers when I was down there with the Secretary and asked them about the program and why they hadn't purchased coverage, and they indicated that it was too expensive to buy. One reason that may be is that oftentimes we have very poor data on which to base the initial rates on, and as a product becomes more mature over time, we have better data to bring rates down in terms of reflecting actual risk to the producer. So we are looking at and have directed resources to go to discussing the recent events with pecan tree growers in order to improve the product for future disasters. But with that, I'll let Steve talk a little bit about the TAP program.
Okay, but I do want you to address the supplemental request question also in terms of the information that was provided
Sure.
to OMB.
Thank you. The tree assistance program, why it's perceived as not being as responsive, is a cost share program where we cost share for the reestablishment of planting the trees. And so ultimately that requires the producer to complete practices and provide receipts for work that has been completed. And so when you find yourself in a hurricane or a disastrous situation where a lot of the trees have been damaged, sometimes there's difficulty in finding replacement stock to be able to replant those trees. So by design of the program, based on the fact that it's a cost share program, it does add a delay with regard to the assistance that's being provided to the producer. Not only in the fact that they've got to complete the practices first before we reimburse them for that cost share, but also the fact that there may be some delays determining on when is the proper time to plant the trees, the pecan trees, or whether there's adequate stocks to be able to be available so producers can complete those practices.
So regarding the preparation of the budget request from OMB, that was across multiple components of USDA, so I can only speak to the agencies in FPAC, and that would have been EWP and ECP for the most part, in EFRP as well as ELAP. I'll ask Mr. Jordan to discuss a little bit the EWP request and how we came up with that information.
Thank you very much. The EWP, of course, we went into those, we had employees that would go into those impacted areas, and first of all, we held a series of workshops in each of those impacted counties to make sure that the producers, the landowners within those counties had full awareness of what the opportunities were. And then we began to do damage site assessments to determine the extent of the damage, working hand in hand with the local sponsors. And that's how we arrived at the various numbers in those impacted states as it pertains to EWP.
What about the Emergency Conservation Program and the Forest Restoration Program?
The estimates that we came up for the Emergency Conservation Program obviously were early on and were based mainly on Katrina, devastation that occurred in Katrina when we suffered multiple years of hurricanes. And so initially our request was based on that historical information. Since then, and as time has progressed, we've actually gotten applications that have come in, and so our numbers have come through to be roughly around $206 million at this point in time. But we do expect those numbers to continue and those applications to continue. So we believe that the $375 million request initially, although it was based on Katrina, a lot of the information from Katrina, the bottom line is we're starting to see that trend where those applications are continuing to creep up, even though we currently are sitting at about $206 million.
So are you anticipating that they will continue to climb and that the $375 million will not be adequate?
We believe the $375 million will be adequate based on what we've received thus far. We believe there's enough there to cover both not only the wildfires but also the implications of the hurricanes. With regard to EFRP, the same methodology was used associated to the $50 million request was based on Katrina information, our historic information associated with Katrina. Currently, we're at about $14.8 million in requests. And again, recognizing the fact that we still have work to do and applications coming in, we believe that $50 million will be adequate in this request.
Ranking member, though, but I think your question extended beyond the agencies and FPAC in terms of our request. And we would be if you want to submit a question for the record, we can certainly get back to you with additional information from other components of USDA.
Thank you. Our concern is just that we want to make sure that we do, when we do the supplemental, provide enough resources for an adequate recovery so that we don't find ourselves in the same situation with inadequate responses. Thank you very much.
Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you holding this hearing as we, I think, all have experienced in this country tough years in terms of agriculture and the economy and producers and farmers, and the last thing any of our farmers needed were the hurricanes or the wildfires and the disasters that just piles on to the tough times farmers are seeing. And I appreciate the comments of my colleague Mr. Bishop as we ensure that this supplemental request and the supplemental funding, that we have the proper policies in place, the proper payment limits in place, that we know that what we spend here will help farmers get back on their feet and will appropriately resolve the losses that they suffered in most cases through no fault of their own, but through natural disasters. And so I wanted to ask you about a couple of the programs, the Livestock Indemnity Program and the Emergency Conservation Program that I know we've been discussing this morning. In Kansas in particular, in the last few years, we've had experience with the livestock program and the conservation program, and there were numerous cases in both the Starbuck fire and the April blizzard where the payment limit was far below the losses experienced by ranchers, feeders, and dairy farmers. And it's been calculated that the payment limit equaled the value of about 80 cows, and in both disasters, there were Kansans who lost hundreds and even thousands of cattle. In addition, in 2016 and 2017 wildfires, many ranchers experienced fence losses that were greater than $200,000 payment limit. With fence replacement costs of about $10,000 per mile, relatively small ranches were impacted by the payment limit. And I guess maybe a question for Mr. Peterson or Dr. Johansson. Can you comment on these payment limits, and do you think the appropriate amounts paid were sufficient for the producers in those Kansas cases, and are they, how are they going prospectively into these newest disasters?
For the Livestock Indemnity Program, the payment limitation of $125,000 is a combined limitation between 3 of those programs that were authorized under the 2014 Farm Bill. That payment limitation is legislated, and so we recognize the fact that if producers have multiple losses, not only livestock but also grazing losses, it could tap into that $125,000 and may be inadequate. With regard to the ECP limitation of $200,000, that is a limitation that was established to mitigate the amount of funding we typically have. Obviously, if you do expand limits, payment limits, then it will tap into additional funding requests that would be necessary that we may not be able to accommodate.
Do you know how many producers had reached those payment limits in these types of wildfires or in any other disasters?
Unfortunately, I do not have that information available, but it's something we definitely can pull together. We have that information that we could provide that for the record.
Well, I think in our disaster program oversight, I think we need to really know, are we helping all producers, and are we ensuring that people are being made whole? And if the total value, as I've been told, is the value of 80 cows, in some cases Kansas lost thousands of cows, they're clearly not going to be made whole and going to suffer severe hardships at a time in which the ag economy is already a hardship on them. On top of it, in the same line of conversation, there were several instances in the 2017 fires where injured cows could have been safely harvested. However, from a financial standpoint, the rancher was better off euthanizing the cows in order to be eligible for LIP payments. There's no doubt that having a partial payment option would have reduced the cost of the disaster, made better use of the injured cows, as FSA considered giving greater flexibility for payments when addressing situations like this.
I guess this is the first opportunity that I've heard with regard to producers were euthanizing cows to make themselves eligible for LIP. We'll definitely take that into consideration and follow up associated, whether we need some policy associated with that.
And then I've also had concerns about the prescriptive fence requirements back on the ECP, and that the ECP's fence specifications are overly prescriptive. Of course, the last thing a rancher wants to do after a disaster is to invest in a new fence that won't hold cattle. Given the scope of the 2016 and 2017 fires, more flexibility would have benefited more Kansas ranchers. I'm sure it would benefit more of the hurricane casualties as well. Is the FSA aware of this problem, and has the agency considered a more common sense approach to the fence specifications required for compliance with the ECP?
Yes, when we were made aware of the concerns, because we recognized that some producers wanted to use steel pipes and things that maybe typically had not been part of the practices or elements that we use within the fencing, we did make some modifications to allow producers to do that, and we will continue to review that policy to determine whether there are additional normal practices that can be used and to accommodate.
And the last question I have is just on timing. Many producers have complained about the delay in receiving some of these payments, particularly in the ECP payment program. My understanding, there's been challenges in terms of available funding, as well as delays in USDA personnel being able to conduct the inspections required to authorize payment. Have you considered adding provisions that would allow for cost share payments up front, or how do we, or other measures to resolve the delays in payments?
One of the things that we have been trying to make certain all states are aware of is the fact that FSA does allow partial payments. One of the critical key components with regard to producers receiving cost share under the ECP program is the fact that practices have to be complete. However, they don't have to be fully complete. If they're asking for 10 miles of fence and they only have 5 miles completed, they can bring those receipts into the local county office and receive a partial payment for the work that's been completed. We're trying to make certain that message is out there and the outreach is out there. Also with regard to the fencing and the delays, one of the biggest concerns that we have, of course, is the fact that when those producers bring in those receipts, then the concern has been is that we have to go out and inspect the fencing. One of the things that we've worked together with our counterpart NRCS is the fact that we've divided our resources with regard to inspecting the fences. NRCS is going out and inspecting all new fencing. FSA is focusing specifically on repaired fencing. So we're actually trying to mitigate some of the delay associated that by trying to identify additional efficiencies that we can apply.
Thanks for your testimony. Thank you, gentlemen.
Ms. Pingree.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the chair and ranking member for holding this hearing, to all of you for being with us today. And I want to associate myself with many of the things my colleagues have already said about the size of the request, making sure we have accurate estimates, and given the nature of so many disasters happening at exactly the same time, and the challenges many farmers already have with previous issues in terms of making the numbers work, this is a critically important time that we get them the right amount of relief. I'm going to get much more specific about some of the things that I've heard from our delegate from the Virgin Islands. And I know there's been a fair amount of focus on Puerto Rico, and I appreciate the challenges there are huge too. I know that you asked many of the state-based USDA employees to participate, and we were very proud to send one of our employees from Maine down to Puerto Rico, and I think he's just about to return. So again, I think that's critically important, and I appreciate your mobilizing everybody you possibly could. But I think that we still have a long ways to go in the territories, and like so many issues for the territories, they're often overlooked and underfunded and treated differently from the states. So I hope that we are spending the time to make sure that there are adequate assessments for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Specifically to the Virgin Islands, which sometimes has an even more challenging problem than Puerto Rico because they're just one more step removed. I have a few questions. Some of them are about FSA. For the Virgin Islands, FSA support is actually in Florida. Of course, Florida had its own agricultural issues, and that's over 1,000 miles away. Much of the other support comes from Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's dealing with their own challenges. So one of the questions is, how are you getting people there? What actions has the department taken to make sure that we are making adequate assessments? My understanding is they were already lacking technical assistance. What are we doing to make sure that they're getting the support that they need? Also, since many of the farms in the island territories are small, independent producers, what's FSA doing to get many of them registered, previously, just to make sure that they're getting the support that they need? My understanding is that there was an ad hoc relief program created by the department in October for farmers in Puerto Rico, which gave them vouchers to buy feed from local dealers. This wasn't provided to the Virgin Islands, which was similarly devastated by Maria. Is there any reason they weren't treated in the same way? And I guess my last sort of question in that whole group is again really reflecting what some of my colleagues have said. Are we doing an accurate assessment down there? We don't think about the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico as agricultural producers, but one of the problems they've had in a challenging economy is that they haven't produced enough of their own food, and so much of it is imported. And as they've been attempting to grow that sector, it didn't seem prior to the disaster that they had adequate support for the USDA in doing that. As we can see, the people who serve the islands are often a long ways away or overworked. So what are we doing to make sure that, given the little bit of progress that they had made and the importance of their agricultural sector growing, are we going to get them the relief that they need?
Yes, of course, the two hurricanes that hit the Caribbean devastated those economies, and certainly we know that agriculture was, in terms of growth in those economies, was one bright sector where we were seeing additional whether it be value-added crops or what have you, some of the plantation crops, we're providing a good opportunity for those economies to realize some gains when some parts of the of their economies perhaps weren't growing as well. And certainly we know that both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands pose a challenge for distance reasons, but also due to the fact that they were so affected by the hurricanes. We did put a good amount of effort into getting personnel to the islands. You mentioned one component in terms of our efforts at providing assistance to the dairy sector in Puerto Rico, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But I'll turn to Steve and Leonard here to talk a little bit about FSA's and NRCS's actions, both in Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Congresswoman, I think you already alluded to the staff that we deployed to both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and we had 4 teams consisting of 4 members, and one of the teams had specific responsibility for the Virgin Islands as well as Puerto Rico. We have 2 dedicated staffs in the Virgin Islands that keep us abreast of developments, needs, and so forth, and they coordinate very, very timely with the director there that's located in Puerto Rico. We also provided a lot of portable generators and things like that to help them. We provided a lot of different resources to make sure that they had the things that were necessary in order to get back on their feet. So we continually work. In fact, we have a dedicated person down there now that's kind of overseeing all operation and communication with the secretaries of agriculture and others to continue to explore what needs they have so that we can address those needs timely.
I would echo Mr. Jordan's comments. We are relying on one of his staff in Puerto Rico, and they have made several trips to the Virgin Islands to assess the situation, meet with the commissioner there to identify what the needs are. Like NRCS, FSA has 2 permanent staff in the Virgin Islands to accommodate and take applications. You are absolutely correct with regard to the management of the Virgin Islands is out of the Florida State FSA office. And just the week before Thanksgiving, we did have the district director that manages the Virgin Islands actually go to the Virgin Islands, spent a week with the commissioner identifying what the assessments were, and also meeting with our USDA representatives there to make certain that we were addressing the needs. We don't have as many applications. We have fewer producers, obviously, on the Virgin Islands than we do Puerto Rico. To address the dairy assistance program for Puerto Rico, I have to say that a lot of pieces came together for that program to turn around very quickly and roll out assistance as quickly as it did. The need was the fact that producers did not have cash or accessible cash to purchase feed. And so recognizing that, we worked with the Puerto Rico Department of Agriculture to identify, and one of the good things they had was a really good list of dairy operations with dairy licensing so that it could mitigate some of the need of actually interacting with the producer. A lot of that information was already up front. The second piece of that was working with the vendors. In Puerto Rico, there are 3 vendors that actually distribute feed. And so we worked with the vendors to make certain that this was a program that they could work with, recognizing the fact that we were going to initiate vouchers for producers to acquire feed, but then the department, FSA, was going to reimburse those vouchers and make certain the vendors were understanding that it might be a week to 2 weeks with regard to being able to make good on the vouchers that we issued to the producers. We did not hear or did not have any indication with regard to Virgin Islands that there was a feed need at this point in time. But the feed program that you have referenced has been a very big success in Puerto Rico in assisting those producers.
Well, thank you. I've gone way over my time. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I will follow up in writing to ask you a few more specifics about the numbers, so thank you.
Mr. Rooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Johansson, as you know, Florida's been devastated by an issue called greening since about 2007, when we had a predicted 162 million boxes produced to last year, that dropping to 68.7 million boxes. That's the lowest since 1964, thanks to the help of this committee. and the efforts that the chairman's been helping me with, we're looking to have a pretty good year this year, about 75 million boxes, which is definitely better than it's been, especially trend-wise. But after Hurricane Irma, that limit dropped to about 50 million boxes, which is obviously the lowest that we've seen in a long, long time. Our Department of Agriculture estimated the damages to be about 760 million. I think that you estimated that to be even higher. What I want to talk about is what you said in your opening with regard to crop insurance. You said that you thought that crop insurance was doing a good job, Dr. Johansson. There's about most of the people that are sitting behind you right now came up from Florida and are my growers. And they have been devastated by this storm. They're at the end of their rope. And when you say that crop insurance is doing a good job, I'd like you to answer to them why you think that that is applicable to Florida orange juice. And I want to give you some stats real quick that you can maybe even stay after and talk to them, as they spoke to the Secretary after the storm when he came down and visited our groves and flew over the groves and saw the devastation with his own eyes, told our growers that there was going to be help on the way, and yet there's nothing. So I want to just throw some stats at you, and hopefully you can respond. 77% of the citrus acreage in Florida is covered by some form of crop insurance. However, crop insurance for citrus does not provide the same level of coverage policies for the large-scale commodity, like other large-scale commodity crops. Citrus is produced in just 3 states, and by and large, you know that most of that is in Florida. So this isn't just a Florida issue. If we want to grow orange juice in this country, it's an American issue, or we're going to import it. And I think with this administration and their focus on making America great again, the last thing that our constituents or this country wants to hear is that Florida orange juice or orange juice in America no longer exists. And that's what we're faced with. That's the reality of the situation. So when you say crop insurance is doing a good job, the level of coverage offered through basic citrus insurance policy only provides payments that cover 55% of the value of losses to growers who lost at least 50% of their crop. That means for those growers who are insured but lost less than 50% of their crop, insurance will pay them nothing. For those covered producers who lost over 50% of their crop, citrus crop insurance only kicks in for losses exceeding that 50%, and payments only cover a little over half of the value of those crops. Therefore, even if a grower with so-called full coverage lost 100% of his citrus crop during the storm, his insurance will only compensate him for about 25% of their losses. Look, we have a crop insurance problem, and that needs to be addressed in the next farm bill with regard to citrus. We all agree with that. But that does not help the people that are sitting behind you right now. That does not help us after we were just devastated by the storm. Our job as representative, and your job, I think, as a government employee, is to solve problems. We have a problem right now. Saying that crop insurance is fine is wrong. And saying that the Farm Bill is something that we should look forward to addressing this problem in the future is true. But that doesn't help us solve this problem now. What these growers need to get to next year is help from their government, help from me, their congressman, and help from this committee. And unfortunately, we needed help from you. And what I would like to hear from you is to tell these growers that are sitting behind you why crop insurance you think is doing a good job for them specifically after everything that I just said, and what we can look forward to in the future with regard to solving their problem.
So obviously the Florida situation with respect to greening has been one that the department's been working with members of the subcommittee here on over a good number of years. And it's one that we're going to probably have to keep working on, because we do see production with respect to Florida citrus continuing to be affected by the greening issue. We've seen declining yields year over year, going back now 6 or 7 years, and we've been looking to work with the industry and finding solutions to that problem. And I agree, it's a problem. That's a problem that is somewhat unique, presents unique challenges to producers when they think about how to manage the risk. whether through crop insurance or other means. For example, when we look at most of the products that are available for row crops, for example, or even some of the tree crops, we assume in those cases that yields are going to be increasing every year, right? In Florida citrus, that's not the case. So you're in the sense of
Florida citrus, it's all citrus. All the states that produce citrus experience the same problem. So it's not just a Florida issue.
In the case of,
we like to say that, but it's not true.
So in the case of citrus, greening is presenting a difficult challenge with respect to how crop insurance performs. I think one of the issues that you raised was how can we have such a high level of participation but low level of coverage on the citrus crop? And I think that's what a lot of the growers would say, and they point out to the fact that if they only have catastrophic coverage, they need to have, and they have a loss of 50% or less, they're not going to get any assistance at all. And that's essentially what we're showing when I tried to put together the numbers for the estimate to the committee in terms of the losses for the citrus in Florida and why crop insurance doesn't provide a larger indemnity for those producers. And that's primarily because most of the producers, or about half, have catastrophic coverage. And to your point, if you need to have, for that to pay out, you need to have an enormous loss. If you have a 40%, 30%, 20% loss on those crops or those trees, you're not going to get a payment at all. Why do you have so much cat coverage for citrus relative to corn or soybeans or cotton or peanuts? I think citrus greening is one issue. I think the fact that it's a tree crop is another issue, and I'll address those separately. Citrus greening, as we've been discussing, has reduced yields year over year. That makes it more difficult for producers to make ends meet, given they're going to get lower yield the next year, plus their costs are increasing. So the margins on citrus growers are getting very tight. I mean, and that's no surprise to any producer in America, as we've mentioned the last couple of years with the way commodity prices have been. A lot of producers are having a hard time making ends meet, and their cost of production exceeds their expected revenue. What do producers do in those times? Well, certainly we've seen this across the board. Producers will cut back on expenditures when they can, and one way that citrus producers have done that is by lowering the amount of coverage that they buy, because it is expensive. It's one expense that when they have to look at their ways that they can get by and make a profit, that's one places that you can cut back. And if you don't have a loss, then it doesn't hurt you. But if you do have a loss, that's obviously going to affect you. So I think one of the reasons that citrus presents a challenge to crop insurance is the fact that you have declining yields year over year due to citrus greening. Solutions for that are many and varied, and we can discuss those. Happy to talk with producers afterwards, and I think we have a meeting set up tomorrow to talk with them as well. The second point, being a tree crop, tree crops are very difficult. As I mentioned earlier to Ranking Member Bishop, we have tree crops for such things as pecans, but we don't have a lot of buy-up on them because they are expensive, because those trees, when RMA values those trees in terms of setting the premium rates, they're expensive. If you lose a grove of citrus, it's an extremely expensive proposition, and so we're forced by the statute to rate that at an actuarially fair rate. We do provide, obviously, premium subsidy to producers, just like we do to a corn producer, we do to citrus producers, but that may be insufficient to cover when a producer is looking at their bottom line if they want to pay that type of premium for covering their crop. Of course, catastrophic coverage doesn't have that. CAT coverage is essentially just a $300 fee, essentially, for coverage, and it's not based on the value of the crop. And so when you have CAT coverage and we say the participation is high, it's not as if those producers are buying up and providing higher levels of coverage. So when I made the more generic statement that crop insurance is working, it's obviously working better for some crops than others, and I would certainly acknowledge that fact. And going to how we can improve this for producers, We have mechanisms built into the crop insurance statute that enable producers to come in and work on policies if they think they're not working for them. And we have worked since 2004, 2005 with the citrus industry to improve options available to their for purchasing crop insurance. Like, for example, looking at the deductible, having such a high deductible before they start triggering, we've looked at ways of lowering that deductible in a way that would allow the coverage to ramp up to a 90% level. That, again, is something that we are more than open to talk to producers about how we can improve that. In terms of whether we're sort of set by statute in terms of what our premium subsidy can be. So if, that's why I was saying in the next opportunity to change that would be the Farm Bill. And so if Congress believes that the premium subsidy rates, looking across crops, for example, looking at row crops relative to tree crops, for example, should be distinguished and made different, that's something that we would be happy to provide technical resources with the committee members on. But again, just to say, I'm more than happy to stay after and talk with producers, discuss this in more detail. And again, I think we have a meeting tomorrow, but also open any time to getting on the phone or talking with producers about this issue.
Mr. Laurel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I have a quick question. I've got a bunch of questions, but are Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico eligible for crop insurance? They are, okay. And I'll just make a point that, and that is that, but also tell me, is that the U.S. Federal dollars picking up the cost like we do with the regular crop insurance program of over about 60% of the cost for premiums and fees? Is that accurate? They're not.
Congresswoman, I was just told that we don't offer crop insurance in the Virgin Islands. We do have crop insurance in Puerto Rico.
And that's the same as it is here in that case, is that
that's correct.
We pick up the tab for over 60% of the administrative costs.
We provide premium subsidy as well as administrative cost.
For,
whether it's 60% or not will depend on the level of coverage that producers purchase.
Well, it's what's here. That's what we pick up here. In any case, just as a point with regard to, and this comes from the Secretary of Agriculture in Puerto Rico, industry financial loss to the agriculture sector, $240 million in agricultural products, $1.8 billion in damages to infrastructure, storage facilities, irrigation, fences as a result of the damage, destroyed 70% of the poultry sector's facilities, killing 2.2 million chickens. Dairy sector had about 4,200 cows either severely affected or killed. I just posit that I'm going to submit for the record questions about infrastructure, about what are we doing with regard to rebuilding infrastructure in Puerto Rico. I associate myself with some of my colleagues' comments as well, but there's $1.8 million damages to infrastructure, and what are we doing there to help rebuild those efforts as well. One of the things that concerns me, Mr. Chairman, with the hearing today is that USDA's role in disaster assistance, and we don't have anyone here from the Food and Nutrition Service to testify. FNS administers several nutrition assistance programs, which are especially vital in times of disaster. So I support all that you do. I hope there is an opportunity to hear about what FNS does. And this is what I would like to try to get to in terms of questioning. Puerto Rico has a block grant. We need to expand the food stamp program in Puerto Rico to ensure the program can respond to what's happened following Hurricane Maria. We ought to be able to provide U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico with the same resources as U.S. citizens in other states. In Texas and Florida, after Hurricanes Harvey and Irma, the government issued emergency food stamps to people who do not usually receive benefits, and additional benefits were given to families who already received assistance. This did not happen in Puerto Rico. A couple questions with regard to this. Why didn't the administration immediately include a request for additional nutrition assistance in Puerto Rico? Does the administration believe the nutrition needs of U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico are being met? How will the department address long-term changes in the need for nutrition assistance on the island of Puerto Rico following the hurricane? It's also my understanding that there's a serious question with regard to FNS and infant formula. How and where is that being delivered?
I think you mentioned you were going to submit your questions for the record.
No,
so.
I submitted the question on infrastructure. I'm hoping that you have some answers in this area. You may or may not. FNS is not identified here. Very, very serious issue that we have and I have dealt with going back to Katrina on food stamps for people who need them at this time. This did not happen with regard to Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I cannot speak for FNS, and I don't have any information on that. So would, of course, be more than happy to bring those questions back to USDA and get answers for you.
Well, okay, I will do that as well. Quite honestly, the administration misled Puerto Ricans about when food distribution sites were up and running. We do not know when a first food distribution site was opened. We don't know how many total sites there were across the island. And the folks, American citizens, truly left high and dry. I will mention the questions, and I'm going to assume that you, well, I won't assume. Can you answer these questions? Who was responsible for putting Puerto Rican mayors in charge of food distribution, which did not occur in other areas? Did FEMA mandate these mayors to have plans for food distribution? Who reviewed the plans? When were the first food distribution sites opened? How many food distribution sites were there in total? No answers to any of those questions.
No, unfortunately, I can answer for you questions you may have about FPAC mission area, but I cannot answer for FNS.
Okay. This is, almost half the island still does not have power. Okay. USDA specific outreach plan to ensure farmers and ranchers in places without power are being contacted about available assistance. How many USDA agency staff are in Puerto Rico? How many of these are directly working on farmer outreach? What is the condition of the FSA's county offices in Puerto Rico? How many are fully operational? What is the timeline for assistance? How long is it taking for the various agencies to process applications and claims? How much longer until assistance is provided to the farmer?
So in terms of
outreach
staffing,
to those without power.
Yeah, FSA staffing and offices in Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands, as well as some of the other affected areas. We have 53 staff in Puerto Rico right now from NRCS and 3 in Virgin Islands. We have...
that includes the Virgin Islands. That's Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico?
3 in Virgin Islands, 53 in Puerto Rico from NRCS. We have additional staffing from FSA. How many do we have? 30 total. So we have 30 total.
How are they getting to the folks who still do not have power?
Well, I'll leave it to Steve and Leonard to talk about our outreach. I know we have been attempting to meet with producers in rural areas in Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands. In many cases, obviously that's complicated by the fact that there isn't a lot of telephone or electricity service, and roads are have been in bad shape. But I know that we have made outreach. In fact, we had a lot of opportunities to do, whether over the radio outreach to producers, as well as in-person contact. But I'll turn it to Steve, and then I'll turn it to Leonard.
Thank you. The Joint Field Operations Center down in Puerto Rico has established meeting sites across the Puerto Rico island of Puerto Rico, and we had several outreach meetings where I don't have the exact
Can people
numbers.
get to, well, my time is gone, but can people get to them? I just heard Mr. Johansson say that the roads are impassable. Many of the roads are impassable. Transportation is a problem in Puerto Rico.
I believe that you're absolutely correct. There are some infrastructure issues and problems
Serious
down
issues,
there.
right.
It is taking additional time to be able to reach those locations. I think that are passable. I know with the employees that we sent down to Puerto Rico, we're actually having to shuttle them ourselves we're actually sending them to the 9 field offices we have across Puerto Rico. You're absolutely correct that not all offices have communications. There are only 3 of the municipality offices that we can communicate electronically, along with our state office. We still have our offices open where we can take manual applications and interact with those producers, and then those applications are being sent to those offices that have communications so that we can continue to process applications.
In addition to what Steve just shared with you, we also provide some bilingual assistance by which producers, wherever they are, they can at least call in and make contacts. We have a network of formal employees that are located in various geographical areas in Puerto Rico. They have established a network by which they can work with the producer in those impacted areas and try to at least address what their needs are and communicate those needs back to the central office. So we've done extensive outreach. We provide power generators and gas cans in order to get the power up, make offices and other places accessible. We've done some extensive work.
Right, and I will conclude. I thank the chairman, but there has been an enormously slow and inadequate, in my view, irresponsible what was a humanitarian crisis on this island. They are American citizens. We have taken an inordinate amount of time to address serious needs. We go into foreign lands that where we go, and whether it is a hostile area or not, we set up hospitals, we set up cities, we clear roads, we do everything to make it what it should be for our military and our troops to get into these areas to do their job. We have the capacity to do this. We somehow decided not to do this in Puerto Rico. With American citizens, and that I find outrageous dealing with, and thank you. And the Virgin Islands as well. Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Thank you, and thank you for your patience, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here. California wildfire. So as you know, the wildfire season has been especially devastating for the western United States, including California. One of the most extreme fires swept through Northern California in October and caused record-breaking damage. The President declared a disaster following these most recent fires, which burned through 20,000 acres in under 12 hours and displaced thousands of people basically overnight. Can you give me a quick update on USDA funding for the state in reaction to the California wildfires so far this year? And moving forward, how do you plan to balance the needs of those in the southeast with hurricane-related damages and those in the west dealing with very different kinds of damage caused by wildfires?
Yeah, of course, there's been some devastating wildfires in California. We've got information on that from a perspective from NRCS and FSA, as well as RMA, and just to underline the fact that those did come in a little bit later than the other estimates that we have. So again, those estimates are pretty premature, but we'll start with NRCS and then turn to FSA.
Thank you very much. From the land protection piece, the range lands that were severely impacted, we've been working with the local sponsors. We've identified and provided $4 million recently to California to address the range plantings, fences needed, so forth, associated with the devastation. We have teams that are continually doing EWP assessments, and they have come up with a total of about $150 million needed for EWP. And the $4 million I talked about was EQIP. and they have that money in hand to begin to address some of the needs of those producers. And we're continually working with the sponsors and the landowners in those impacted areas to try to continue to flush out additional needs so that we will then look at what fund we may have available already, and we will promise to provide to the extent that we can the fund we have available to address those needs. We're very sensitive to those needs.
With regard to the wildfires, one of the positive things is the fact that under the 2014 Farm Bill, we do have some permanent disaster legislation, such as the Livestock Indemnity Program, which would cover livestock death losses. That is a fully funded program, so as much funds as are necessary, basically, to get the losses paid for. The Tree Assistance Program also is a fully funded program, so if there are damages to vines, vineyards, shrubs, trees, those crops that actually produce fruit, that program is available, provide cost share assistance. With regard to the Emergency Conservation Program, ECP, of course, that is not a fully funded program and requires us to come and request appropriations associated to receive additional funding. Currently for California, for wildfires specifically, there's a request of $15 million that is unfunded, that's oversubscribed as a result of why that's part of the request that we have before you. Also, we have the non-insured crop disaster assistance program that does provide assistance to those producers that cannot avail themselves for crop insurance, that crop insurance is not available. And typically at this point in time, as a result of the wildfires, we've paid indemnities up to about $500,000. So we do have assistance. We have ongoing work that's being provided under these disaster programs. In addition, we've worked with the state offices to ensure that that leadership mitigates where the demand is with regard to workload. And California has 147 employees in California that they can shift around as a result of California being such a large state. They can shift some of those resources into the areas that have been adversely impacted.
My next question.
I'll just point out that we also had, obviously, producers of some commodities will be covered by crop insurance as well in California. So at least looking at the grape, the coverage we had for grapes, most of the crop had been harvested, so there are going to be some vine losses, but we think from the grape side, almost 90% of the crop had been harvested, so that's going to limit the amount of indemnities that we would expect. But I think our initial estimates, unfortunately, it's probably in front of me somewhere, but I can't find it. I think it's around $10 million was our estimate that went into our overall estimate that we came up with.
And then following the major disaster there, like the fire, I understand it takes some time for the local and state governments to properly assess the damage and make accurate and adequate requests for federal relief funding. Do you have the information you need as an agency to respond to the need in California? And if not, what information is outstanding?
Well, from the FPAC perspective, obviously we have a lot of employees that are out there gathering information and making sure that we're available for producers to come in and submit applications for our programs. Obviously, we like to hear, as we have in Florida's case, when we haven't provided enough staffing in order to take in those applications, and we typically redirect resources to make sure that we're working through the backlog as quickly as possible. So to the extent that you hear that you're not, we obviously do outreach as well, but sometimes you're hearing from it more quickly than we do. So if you're hearing that your producers aren't getting the kind of customer service that they're expecting, we need to hear that, and then we can make sure that we put more staff out there in order to work through any kind of long-term claim issue that we might have. We did the same thing, for example, in the upper northern plains when we had a lot of drought applications coming in this past summer. So that's one thing. I guess I'll ask Leonard or Steve if there's anything else that you might need from the state of California or from different regions.
No, I don't think so. I think the continued communication, the dialogue, just to keep the dialogue going back and forth, and we'll try to address as needed.
All right.
I want to correct something, though. I think my new toys got my figures wrong. I think I may have mentioned 150 million, and I meant 1.5 million that at this point in time, the assessment has been done to determine that the EWP needs. So I just want to clarify that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the spring of this year, South Mississippi experienced a small-scale natural disaster in the form of excessive rainfall experienced from Tropical Storm Cindy. Many of my farmers suffered a 50 to 70% loss of their crops, some in blueberries and many in watermelons. We work closely with the Secretary's office to designate these areas as agricultural disasters, which, as you know, triggers targeted disaster assistance to those affected farmers. Many farmers that I have visited with since the disaster highlight two major concerns, and hopefully I'll have time to get to both of them. So number one is, once the county is declared an agricultural disaster area, one of the main recovery tools made available to these farmers is in the form of emergency low-interest loans through the FSA. Many of my constituents have expressed concerns to me about the loan programs being of little value to them, as the prevailing interest rates are just as high as rates on a normal operating loan from a commercial lender. And the collateral requirements may also be too stringent for people that just experienced a major natural disaster and are in dire straits. So are you hearing this from any other areas of the country, and is there anything Congress can do to make these programs operate in a more user-friendly manner in times of emergency need?
Certainly that's something we've heard about, in terms of the fact that the interest rates right now in the emergency loan program aren't essentially advantageous relative to other loans that we may offer, either at FSA or in the private sector. But I'll ask Steve if he has any other ideas about how we might improve those for providing better relief in times of a crisis.
One of the things that we have seen a trend on, obviously when we see downturns in prices, we see more activity with regard to loans. And in fiscal year 2016-17, it's been the highest record yield associated to FSA loans, and providing loans is the first opportunity for those producers that can't get regular coverage. I agree with Dr. Johansson in the sense that the emergency loan rate is what we're finding is actually, with it being static at 3.325%, that typically you can get a lower interest rate through our direct loan or our operating loan. So most producers are trending towards that, but I had not heard about the collateral concerns associated to come up with the collaterals. It's something that we definitely could take a look at and see what those concerns are.
My second concern deals with the non-insured crop disaster assistance program. There are many specialty crop growers in my districts. It has been very important to us. For the producers that utilize the NAP, I've heard concerns about the $125,000 payment limit being too restrictive or too low for fruit and vegetable growers who may produce on a large-scale level of production as they participate in the program. Reaching the $125,000 limit on a diversified fruit and vegetable operation happens very quickly and can leave a farmer with a portion of his crop unprotected. In your opinion, can this be addressed at the agency, or does this take an adjustment by Congress through Farm Bill legislation?
This is a the payment limitation for the non-insured crop disaster assistance program is legislated. It was increased from $100,000 to $125,000 in 2014 under the 2014 Farm Bill. So it is not something that the agency has control of. It would have to be something that would come under the next Farm Bill possibly for consideration.
There are some opportunities for some of those growers to participate in the whole farm revenue product, crop insurance product that's was put out during the 2014 Farm Bill period. The limit on that is much higher than the limit on NAP. Of course, it's a newer program, and it's relatively complicated. You have to, if you're growing a number of crops under that product, you have to wait till all the returns are in order to process your claim, so it's not as fast as some of the other claim opportunities you may find under NAP or under another multi-peril type of product, which producers are often need in times of responding to a disaster. So, but there is the opportunity to participate in the whole farm product as well.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my question is for any of you three gentlemen on the panel, but President Trump, like many other presidents of both parties before him, instituted a hiring freeze when he took office. And in your testimony, Dr. Johansson, you write, through USDA employees located in nearly every county of the U.S. and territories, immediate support was available to those impacted by these natural disasters. In addition, more than 75 FPAC, Farm Production and Conservation mission area employees accepted temporary assignments away from home to hurricane-affected areas. So the president lifted the hiring freeze, I believe, in April. Are your services and agencies hiring additional staff now? And with the staffing numbers you have now, are you being as effective as you'd like to be when it comes to what you're doing now and what you could be doing?
I think by and large, if you go to any county office across the country and ask them what their pressing concerns are, it's about staff levels. Certainly we know that staffing levels across the three agencies, or more so for NRCS and FSA, have been trending downwards for a number of reasons. The hiring freeze is one that you mentioned. NRCS has done some realignment over the last couple of years, and during that period they also slowed their hiring, bringing their levels down. But we are looking at hiring a good number of customer-facing employees to put out in the counties. In order to support that hiring, we need to collect a lot of information regarding sort of where the needs are, what types of skills do we need to put out there, what type of, and regionally where those employees are best placed. To manage, and that's something that we've been doing as we've been adjusting to the different funding levels that we're facing, whether it's through continuing resolution or expected funding levels through the rest of the fiscal year. So we need to manage appropriately to those levels. At the same time, the Secretary has been clear about wanting to hire the skills that we need and to be the best, customer service agency that we can be. So efficiencies are certainly something we're looking to do. We are looking to hire. We are developing that hiring request. We expect it to be moving forward shortly, and we will be putting those new employees out in the field as soon as we can. But to manage during the disaster, we do have taken advantage of bringing skill sets in from across the country to put them where they're needed. So oftentimes we don't have enough personnel in our county offices to manage a huge load of claims that we may get from a disaster, such as we saw in Florida and Texas and North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, and other places where producers are going to be coming in to file applications for our program. So in those cases, when we don't have enough staffing, we try and manage that through overtime and through some jump teams that we send to those areas to help process those claims. That's what we have been doing, but we do anticipate putting out a number of new employees into the county offices in a short time.
So when you're doing these assessments in the disaster-ridden areas, do you borrow from third parties any kind of help to help you make the assessments? For instance, like State of Florida Department of Agriculture staff, and team up with them to help make the assessments, to get the assessments done so the help can get there sooner rather than later?
We do certainly do that with NRCS. I'll let Leonard talk about that in terms of our partnership.
Thank you. We do utilize the resources available to us, and we have a lot of conservation district employees that have very similar skills as those that we have. But the state conservation is leading that effort in Florida, has capitalized on available resources from various sources.
Okay, and then just really quickly, we talk about a lot about disasters when it comes to crops, whether it be your traditional crops or row crops. But what kind of biosecurity assessment do you have when it comes to livestock to make sure that right away we make sure there's not a disease outbreak because of the conditions that have come across because of these horrible hurricanes and storms?
Oh, that's a great question. I know that my colleagues at APHIS would be able to answer that question much more appropriately than I am. But if you would allow, I'll just take that question back to USDA and get a response for you on the record.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being part of the, the disaster recovery. I will just start by saying thank you for the work you're doing in Puerto Rico. You know, the problem with Puerto Rico with electricity is that it had a publicly owned utility that was run with all the waste, fraud, and abuse you expect from a publicly owned utility. And the Whitefish matter was a perfect example. You know, this publicly owned utility that was supposed to restore electricity in Puerto Rico contracted for a company that was paid $319 an hour for a lineman when they were paying the lineman $63 an hour. That's why Puerto Rico doesn't have electricity, because it had a publicly run company that didn't know how to run, that, like I said, with all the waste, fraud, and abuse of any publicly run company. But thank you for working within the constraints of that, because it's a very difficult situation down there, some of which is a problem that's intrinsic to Puerto Rico. Now, with regards to the disaster funding here, the EWP, I take it the EWP is not going to use any of the $500 million for easement purchases, which normally is something that comes under EWP. Is that right? For flood-prone easement purchases?
The numbers that we offered, it will not.
Will not. Okay, that's what I thought. I thought it was just cleanup and things. Now, infrastructure is mentioned several times. You use some of this money for infrastructure. When it's used for infrastructure, because remember, there's a debate going on whether or not we add this to our grandchildren's debt. You know, as a supplemental appropriation, not subject to caps, not subject to the usual constraints the committee works under. Does Davis-Bacon apply to any of these projects that are going to be funded by this money?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, I'd request you get the answer, because as we know, Davis-Bacon greatly inflates the costs. As we saw from what's happening in Puerto Rico, these costs are already inflated when we're talking about disaster mitigation. In the case of Whitefish, again, $63 an hour paid to the lineman, $319 paid to the company that the Puerto Rican government through PREPA actually contracted with. So we have to be careful, because we have to run our finances better than Puerto Rico runs their finances. Okay, so if you can get the answer, I'd appreciate that. Finally, in terms of the offsets, can I go ahead and finish my questioning, Mr. Chairman? Okay, thank you. I think the time is mine, and I don't think I interrupted any other members as they talked about you know, what's going on in Puerto Rico. The administration, in their letter to us, has identified potential offsets. One of the offsets actually is from the same program that we're asking $500 million for, which is, I think, $204 million from EWP, leftover money from Hurricane. Again, you know, look, Hurricane Sandy was a little while ago. Tremendous uproar. Gee, we had to get this emergency funding done. We had to do it today. And it turns out there's $100 million left over still, funds that are probably never going to be used for Hurricane Sandy. Does the department plan to propose that this is an internal offset? I mean, there's $204 million left over in EWP from former disasters that have never been used, and why aren't we? I mean, is this money not able to be used for this right now? Because you're coming for an emergency appropriation. And you're aware of the letter that got sent, right? I mean, you all got a copy, I hope, from the Mick Mulvaney's letter, 85 pages long, that includes the offsets. Yeah, that's right. Leonard, can you speak at all to the offset? I mean, I know in Washington, $204 million isn't even rounding error, but you know, to my people, that's significant. There's $204 million rattling around from the emergency of Hurricane Sandy. Now we're at another emergency. This is the same thing that came up with Zika. You know, you have money rattling around for someone else, and everybody's shaking the cages going, give us more money, give us more money. What about the money we gave you for the last emergency that's left over? So what's the deal with this $204 million?
Unfortunately, the $200 million that you referenced is totally associated with Sandy, right? So in order for the flexibility to be there, it would require statutory. That's all I need to know, the statute. Now, the last thing is the Department of Agriculture and what's called the Farm Security and Rural Investment Account supposedly has $1.419 billion left over. And I don't know, because that's probably not in your accounts, but does the department intend to suggest that that $1.419 billion is actually used to more or less totally offset
the Department of Agriculture's request for this emergency.
Again, then we can get you an answer for.
I'd appreciate that, because again, I think my taxpayers are a little worried about money that rattles around Washington, previously, you know, spent but never spent, and now you come back, and again, it's not us, it's our grandchildren going to be paying for this. And I got grandchildren. I don't want to give them more debt than they already have. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. There's been a lot of, yes.
May I make one brief comment?
Sure, go ahead.
I just wanted to sort of correct the record with regard to the whitefish contract. That was a contract that was done by the Secretary of Interior, who has jurisdiction over that matter. It wasn't, was it whitefish?
He lives in whitefish.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, if I could also have a moment in response.
Go ahead.
I would just suggest that everyone in the room read the press reports that the contract was signed by the PREPA administrator selected by the governor of Puerto Rico, a gubernatorial appointment. And yes, in the end, Interior may have something to do with it, but in the end, that contract was signed by the administrator appointed by the governor of a publicly owned utility that was rife with waste, fraud, and abuse, known for years, part of the basis of the PROMESA Act that we actually passed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, it's my time now, so I don't want to, y'all are getting on my time, so, and we need to really stay at where the issue is. We're focused today. This may be something for a hearing at a later date. So, but, okay. All right. Back to my time now. So there's been a lot of discussion about providing assistance to farmers that are affected by the hurricanes to help with catastrophic losses. In particular, as we have already heard today, the citrus industry claims that this may be the final blow to their domestic production capability after experiencing over 10 years of loss as a result of the disease that we refer to as citrus greening. If Congress were to provide some sort of assistance and a supplemental funding package, I'd like to discuss how USDA and/or the states would provide such assistance prior to considering more permanent tweaks to the safety net programs in the next Farm Bill. Two options that we've considered, include certain some type of one-time revenue protection program that's similar to the agricultural risk coverage price loss coverage program. Another option would be to provide a block grant funding to the states to assist with the agricultural losses. There is concern that simply providing direct disaster payments, something that Congress has done in the past, you know, the bottom line, there's concerns about that. So Congress has debated this issue over the past two farm bills and concluded that these are real concerns. And so my first question, Dr. Johansson, let me point this to you. Could you help the subcommittee understand how your department might implement some type of block grant type program to be administered in conjunction with the states and with also the territories?
So I think we have had experience in the past working with Congress in providing assistance to producers, whether it be through a Section 32 type of mechanism or even a CCC Section 5 mechanism. The block grant mechanism also would be something we could look at in terms of if Congress were to provide USDA with a funding level and an amount that's allocated to the states, and we would work with the states in order to figure out how to apply that. We would need to work with your staff in terms of the details regarding whether we're interested in putting on payment limits or limiting it by AGI, that type of thing. But certainly we are more than happy to bring in our technical experts on how to implement either of those two programs, but the block grant program certainly would be one in which the states would have the ability to identify which crops that or sectors that they thought were in most need based on their determination, and we could work with them to find the mechanism by which we could bring in applications and provide funding, provide those payments to producers.
So that would be something that certainly would be doable.
Yes.
To something in that regard. As we also mentioned, the revenue protection component, similar to the agricultural risk coverage, price loss coverage, is an option that has also been considered to provide assistance to those farmers affected by the hurricanes. Can you tell us what such a program would look like and how the department would implement that?
Certainly, we could look at, of course, the one distinguishing factor for ARC PLC is the fact that it's based on base acres, and so we would need to determine the right acreage base by which we would provide that payment. We could certainly look at something similar to the ARC PLC program in terms of what producers' revenue has been over the last 5 years to set a guarantee, looking at how losses have affected their production this year to determine what the appropriate payment rate would be. And of course, we would need to prorate that to fit under whatever funding mechanism levels that you provided to us to administer the program. That could certainly be implemented in the similar fashion as we do our PLC program. The PLC, not so much of an option for this case, since we're not looking at setting a price, a reference price, but more in terms of responding to producers' lost revenue. Again, I would also think about how we would want to structure that for producers that have bought coverage and those that haven't bought coverage from the crop insurance program in order to make sure that that producers are not being essentially penalized for buying crop insurance.
What do you see as the biggest weakness of either one of those options?
I think both of them are workable. We can figure out a way to do it with your staff. I think I would hesitate to say right at this point in time which mechanism would be preferable and what the main weaknesses are. I'll ask Mr. Peterson or Mr. Leonard if they have any insights on either of those options.
I would just, recognizing ARC PLC is a program where it's based on benchmark yields and establishing a 5-year Olympic average. A lot of these crops, we may not have that 5-year Olympic average. We recognize that we try to use with our main commodities. NASS does provide us a lot of that information. So when on some of these areas that are specialty crops like Florida that have been adversely impacted, establishing that database to allow the program to work similarly to ARC PLC would be a heavy lift. Because it is there's a lot of data associated to that, not only for the crop, but also there could be issues where the producer has individual information that they're providing. So at least for the ARC PLC piece, that to me would be one of the complicating factors. Is as Dr. Johansson indicated, ARC PLC is based on what's normal base acres, and so would the program require a base to be established? And if so, how do we do that? What history do we use to come up with that in past years? And then also the data that would be necessary to determine revenue losses, taking into consideration both yield losses and also price.
One last thing, now my time is coming to an end. What about a requirement that anyone receiving such assistance purchase the highest level of available crop insurance, such as whole farm protection, to ensure against future types of scenarios? Thoughts on that?
I know that we've, I think we utilized a similar provision in a previous, in the 2005 disaster assistance for nurseries and citrus producers in Florida following the number of hurricanes that we had down there at that point in time. I think certainly encouraging producers to avail themselves of that resource would be recommended. I think that's a good idea. I don't know whether it's whole farm or if it is an improved product that we could work on with the industry in terms of getting a multi-peril product available for them under whether it be citrus or cotton or whatever product sector we're talking about, or pecan for that matter. We certainly want to have the products that are available and set at the actuarially fair rates. To echo Mr. Peterson's comments, coming up with an Olympic year average program similar to ARC is dependent on data, and we do need to have both the price level data and the yield data. And one thing on the price side that's difficult for some of these crops is they're contracted, and we hear oftentimes from producers that the valuation that, like for example, an on-tree valuation for oranges is much lower than what the actual valuation should be in terms of delivered crop. And so that would be something else we would need to take a look at, make sure that we have the appropriate information in order to make that valuation. But not insurmountable. I think we could work with either program and in an expeditious manner if the subcommittee so chooses to direct us in that direction.
Bishop. Thank you. I just want to touch on something that was raised earlier having to do with public health. Following the disasters, communities face a lot of health concerns from the decline in quantity and quality of safe drinking water to decreased access to quality health care due to power outages and impaired roadways, making transit to hospitals a non-starter, to food safety issues and resulting in foodborne illnesses, to the emergence of zoonotic diseases stemming from veterinary or animal health issues, to the rise of plant diseases affecting the future of the agriculture industry. So we do have a tough road to hoe. I raise this because the Zika virus was previously reported in Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and Florida before the 2017 hurricane season. In 2016, the CDC stated that close to 90% of adults in Puerto Rico have been infected with the dengue virus, which puts pregnant women at a higher risk following the storms. And a Florida ARS scientists reported that hurricanes aided in the long-range dissemination of citrus canker, which is a bacteria that can be devastating to the Florida citrus growers. Have there been reports of animal and plant diseases and pests? And if yes, which and what is being done by USDA in coordination with the appropriate public health agencies? If not, can you discuss the planning efforts to help minimize the potential impact caused by outbreaks of highly contagious diseases that could impact humans as well as the growing agriculture?
Yeah, it's something that certainly we are familiar with in terms of crop losses or livestock losses as a result of a hurricane passing through and bringing in a disease that may not be prevalent or readily, that our producers may not be readily prepared for. Of course, that's not our agencies that deal with that, and we can certainly get you better answers. But for example, soybean rust, for example, was transmitted that in such a way to the United States through a hurricane, and that's has been affecting soybean production off and on here in the U.S., depending on what. Well, certainly with respect to, for example, in crop insurance, we know that, as I was discussing with your colleague, Mr. Rooney, as due to citrus greening, which is a disease that's also been spread here, we've seen losses in the citrus industry year over year, and that makes it difficult for those producers to to look at their cost of production and figure out whether it's increased treatment or increased risk management is a choice that they're faced with every year. And so, but I think your question is more to the immediate term in terms of human health effects of diseases that may be either spread or exacerbated due to hurricane condition, the post-hurricane conditions that we might see, for example, in Puerto Rico or in some areas of Florida, and that's something certainly that USDA is aware of. We don't interact too much with the human health side in terms of whether we're spraying for mosquitoes or something like that, but on the animal side, we're certainly can get you responses in terms of what our planning is for from APHIS in terms of protecting plant and animal health as a result of disease spread. So, similarly, we had the outbreak of avian influenza a couple years ago, that a similar mechanism that we've tooled up our response efforts on, and we're ready and able to respond to that much more quickly now. And I would imagine the same would be true of some of these other diseases that you'd mentioned.
Yeah, I want to just echo the same concerns I have with my colleague, Mr. Bishop, just regarding, biosecurity. We talk about Zika and the avian influenza that really hit the bird population a few years ago, and in many states across the country. And that was without a disaster in terms of a natural disaster like a storm or a hurricane. So just want to make sure that I guess we need to emphasize to APHIS really this issue and hear back from them. But also in terms of, you mentioned audits by the Inspector General when we're doing disaster assistance and help for those who need it. How do those audits work, and do they come about just to spot check to make sure that the programs are working effectively and that there's no fraud out there? How do you know who to audit and how to audit, and what do you mean by the IG auditing these instances and programs, just really quickly?
The folks at the Office of the Inspector General are the experts at that. I know that we are cognizant of trying to make sure that all of our programs are being implemented in a fashion that ensures eligibility criteria are met before payments are made. That being said, we're also aware that we're expected to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars, and so that's one of the reasons why we do provide additional funding for OIG in cases such as this. I don't have a good answer on what their audit, strategies are for disaster response, different from other strategies that they may have for just normal program implementation, whether it be ARC-PLC or EQIP or what have you. But we can get an answer on that to get your question on what are they just employing additional personnel to look at the specific disaster areas, or is there a different mechanism that they put in place for a emergency response like this?
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to hear that you think it's incumbent on yourselves, the USDA, to make sure that funds are being dispersed properly and that there's no fraud and abuse involved. And it's incumbent upon us as well to make sure that that's happening, so then we can make sure that those dollars get to the people they really, in those programs, who really, really need it. So thank you for your attention and for coming here today, and I thank my colleagues.
Well, thank you all for being here. There may be, I think there are going to be some questions that we're going to submit for the record that we would appreciate your response to. But again, thanks for working on this. We'll follow with some of the things we've talked about here in the hearing this morning, and we look forward to working with you as we move forward on the supplemental.